My name is Eric Gaskell, and you're listening to the Distorted History Podcast.
To speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter.
Shameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
A long struggle for freedom.
It really is a revolution.
Elizabeth Packard had for some 20 years of marriage been the prototypical image of a wife of the Victorian era. She dressed and behaved properly, kept her house neat and tidy, all the while being accounted as an excellent cook and devoted mother to her 8 children. That is, until, according to her husband Theophilus Packard, Elizabeth became, quote, insane on the subject of women's rights. Which is to say, Elizabeth started speaking her own mind and refused to go along with everything her husband said and did. Indeed, Elizabeth would come to characterize her husband as being among, quote, that class of men who wish to rule women seem intent on destroying her reason. Indeed, because Elizabeth had refused to go along with her husband and his church's move towards a more aggressive theology and would not be quiet about her personal beliefs, Theophilus had his wife declared insane and locked away in the Illinois State Asylum and Hospital for the Insane in Jacksonville, which is where we left Elizabeth at the end of the last episode. A sane woman locked away in an insane asylum, still hoping that it wouldn't be too long before she could return to her beloved children. Before we resume her story, however, I want to give credit to my sources for this series: Kate Moore's excellent The Woman They Could Not Silence, Barbara Sepp Inslee's The Private War of Mrs. Packard, and Jeffrey L. Geller and Maxine Harris's Women of the Asylum, Voices from Behind the Wall 1840 to 1945. And like always, these and any additional sources like websites that I use in putting these episodes together will be listed on this podcast Twitter and Ko-fi pages, links to which are in the description. And with all of that being said, let's begin. Elizabeth, despite beginning to have some doubts about him and his asylum, would continue to have her personal one-on-one meetings with the asylum superintendent, Dr. McFarland. She had come to consider him as her, quote, kind friend, as she trusted him and the fact that he was looking out for her best interest. In doing so, she thought nothing about how he tended to do much more listening than talking. Indeed, for Elizabeth, if anything, it was an extremely welcome change of pace to have a man who actually seemed to want to listen to her and her thoughts. Those meddlesome doubts, however, would be given more proof when, during one conversation with Dr. McFarland in his office, she happened to notice that a letter on his desk had clearly been written by her friends the Blessings. Friends who she feared had abandoned her as she had not received a letter from them following their visit, even though they had promised to write. Upon seeing the envelope with their handwriting clearly upon it, Elizabeth excitedly seized a hold of it without even bothering to ask for it. An act she likely didn't think twice about, as obviously this letter had been written to her. Which was why she was surprised when the doctor promptly snatched the envelope back and subsequently refused to tell her about its contents, even though it had clearly been opened already. Up until this point, Elizabeth, despite the creeping doubt she had about the asylum, had continued to think the best of the superintendent. Now, though, she seriously began to suspect that he was not the friend he pretended to be. Indeed, McFarland was regularly withholding and destroying letters sent to and from his patients if they contained anything he did not approve of. In fact, it seems as if he really did not approve of contact with the outside world at all when it came to his patients. This, you see, was all a part of his so-called treatment method. McFarland's goal was to, almost like a cult leader, isolate his patients from their friends and family, so that they would instead, almost out of necessity, come to rely upon him as their only means of support and comfort. It was then through this and his subsequent guidance that McFarland believed he would cure his patients. Essentially, what the doctor wanted was to control every aspect of his patients' lives, believing that by doing so, he would guide them along the path back to sanity. To that end, he looked to control what they ate, what they wore, what they did, and even what they thought. For her part, Elizabeth had known nothing of this manipulation. She had honestly come to trust and to like the doctor. Like I said, she had enjoyed their visits, and she had even danced with him during the regular balls that the asylum held. Indeed, as it turns out, this was actually Elizabeth's first experience dancing in her entire life. You see, Elizabeth, having been raised in a very religious household, and having been married to the deeply religious Theophilus, had simply accepted the teachings that dancing was sinful. However, upon seeing the joy on the faces of the other women in the ward when they had the opportunity to dance during these get-togethers, Elizabeth, as she was seemingly wont to do when provided with new information, re-evaluated her position. So she started taking private lessons from one of the asylum's attendants, Celia Coe. It was then thanks to these lessons that Elizabeth had found herself dancing with her supposed friend, the head of the asylum himself. However, as much as she found this experience enjoyable in the moment, Elizabeth, as a result of the mounting evidence, began re-evaluating Dr. McFarland. Was he not the man he seemed? He, after all, had kept at least one letter from her. How many more had he kept from her and from the other patients? Then there were the outrages committed by the asylum's attendants the other patients had described to her. Could he be fully aware of them like the other women had claimed, and was choosing to do nothing to stop them? He, after all, at the very least, had the tendency of ignoring Elizabeth's friends in the 7th Ward whenever they raised their concerns to him. Yet at the same time he seemed so caring. He, after all, allowed and encouraged her to speak her mind, which was, after all, vastly different from Elizabeth's life with her husband. However, one September afternoon, Dr. McFarland took this affection a step too far for Elizabeth's taste, when, during a meeting in his office, he bent over and kissed her on the forehead. It was nothing more than that, but for Elizabeth, who was steeped in religious tradition and Victorian-era morality, this was extremely forward, considering that they were both married. This then was another incident that led her to have doubts about the doctor, despite how much she wanted to think the best of him. Filled as she was with these conflicting feelings, she also could not help constantly growing more worried about her own situation, as despite promises otherwise, Elizabeth did not seem to be going anywhere after 4 months in the asylum. Then there was the plight of her fellow inmates, who, whenever they raised concerns about their treatment or the conditions in the asylum, were ignored. Elizabeth then wanted to do something to help them. To that end, she turned back to her experience with her husband's Bible classes, as even though they had helped to land her here in the first place, they had been the first time in a long time she felt the pleasure of using her own brain. So, like she had written the essays to present to the Bible classes, Elizabeth now began running down her thoughts in a pair of documents. One of these documents was designed as a kind of proof of her own sanity, while the other was designed specifically to call attention to the abuses she had witnessed happening to her fellow patients in the 7th Ward, noting that, quote, "I will not suffer humanity to be so abused as you do here, without lifting my voice against it." Elizabeth would first share the product of this work with her friends in the ward, who would agree that the accusations she laid out and her descriptions of their treatment were accurate. They, however, could not believe that Elizabeth was actually considering taking such a course of action, as they warned her that McFarland was all-powerful within the walls of the asylum. As such, the idea of going up against him was foolish at best. One even reportedly told her, quote, "You had better not give the doctor that document unless you wish to be sent to a dungeon where you can never see daylight again." Elizabeth, though, would not be dissuaded from her path. She would, though, take a precaution by hiding copies of both of her documents where she hoped they would not be found and destroyed should things go badly. To that end, she pried the backing off her mirror, which was one of the belongings she had actually been allowed to keep. Elizabeth then placed the documents behind the mirror before putting the backing back in place, hopefully hiding and preserving them. With this precaution in place, Elizabeth moved forward with her plan, when on the 26th of October 1860, she chose to give McFarland just the document she had written to prove her sanity, as she did not want to believe the worst of him. This then was kind of a test, a chance to prove that he was the man that she hoped he was. Indeed, at one point in the 21-page letter dedicated to proving that she was perfectly sane, Elizabeth wrote, quote, "Do not disappoint my high, very high expectations of you as a man, one who respects his conscience more than his popularity, one who dares to risk his reputation on doing right, even in the face of a frowning world." Elizabeth wanted to believe that Dr. McFarland was the polar opposite of her repressive husband who had her locked away in the first place. Her hope then was that he would stand in opposition to men like Theophilus and others like him, as she wrote, quote, "Have you not reason to fear that my case fairly represents a class of oppressed women who have been unjustly imprisoned here by unnatural men, who, because they had the power to oppress an unprotected wife, secretly rejoice in the aid which this institution furnishes them for doing it?" As even in this document, designed as it was to have her personally released from the asylum, Elizabeth also looked to plant seeds that would hopefully see other women wrongly institutionalized released as well. Furthermore, Elizabeth was still very much steeped in Victorian-era thinking, which held that men were the protectors of women. She then saw in the doctor the potential protector her husband had failed to be. Indeed, she hoped the doctor might become a protector of sorts against her husband. To that end, in her letter, she actually asked him for the opportunity to work in the asylum should he decide to release her, as she did not want to return to living with her husband since, quote, "He has forced me from home as insane when I am not insane. I shall not be guilty of the insane act of returning to such a protector." Elizabeth, in fact, more than simply giving the doctor the letter, actually presented her case to him in person, as she delivered her statement with the same passion and eloquence she displayed during her appearances in her husband's Bible classes. Afterward, she left the letter with the doctor to give him the opportunity to consider it and the case it made in his own time, believing as she did that he would see the obvious logic and sanity in her statement, which, when combined with his own experiences with her over the past 4 months, would lead him to the only logical conclusion possible. That conclusion being that Elizabeth was right and was not insane, and thus he would grant her wish and release her. Yet again, though, much like his earlier promise that her stay in the asylum wouldn't be long, days passed one after another, yet still she heard not a single word from the doctor that he intended to release her. It was at this point that Elizabeth decided to not give McFarland the benefit of the doubt anymore. He was clearly not the man she hoped he was. Instead, he more resembled the man she feared him to be when taking into consideration all the warning signs she had noted around the asylum. So, after giving McFarland sufficient time, Elizabeth presented the doctor with a second 16-page document, in which she made it clear she had given him the opportunity to be a better man, and was maybe even willing to give him the opportunity to reform without exposing his conduct to the world, as she noted, quote, "I do not approve of publishing your faults to the world until you have had the opportunity first to amend your ways and your doings." That being said, Elizabeth simply could not look the other way considering all that she had seen and heard while in the asylum, as in her experience, quote, "Your discipline is invariable, calculated to increase their difficulties and make them worse rather than better." Notably and most dangerously for Dr. McFarland, this document was not just based upon the observations and word of Elizabeth alone. Instead, it notably contained testimonials from members of McFarland's own staff, like one, for example, who, according to Elizabeth, stated, quote, "Dr. McFarland keeps persons here that are not insane to my certain knowledge," while another would state that, quote, "The patients are so badly treated here that I could never think of having a friend of mine ever come here for treatment," while yet another was said to testify, quote, "If it were not for losing my place here, I would expose Dr. McFarland to the world." Elizabeth then wrapped up her scathing account of Dr. McFarland and his asylum by asserting that, quote, "You cannot tell a sane from an insane person," which meant, in her opinion, that he did not have an understanding of the basics of his profession, and thus was not fit to hold his high office. This missive and its contents did not sit well with the good doctor, as he, much like Elizabeth's husband before him, feared her persuasive abilities, although he did not seem to fear that she actually might bring him down. After all, he was a highly respected superintendent of a mental institution, and she was a patient of his, meaning that she was by definition insane and could not be trusted. Plus, she was also a woman, which meant her word counted little in the world. Instead, what Dr. McFarland feared was Elizabeth's influence over his other patients. He already did not like the prayer circle she had established in the 7th Ward, as he did not want her to become a rival pillar of support that they might rely upon instead of him, which was bad enough, but now he also had a reason to fear that her radical and, in his opinion, insane rhetoric about women's rights might spread to his other patients. Indeed, it seems as if she might have already infected some of the members of his staff with her madness. Elizabeth then was a rabble-rouser, and the last thing he needed was his female patients standing up for themselves and resisting his attempts to fully control every aspect of their lives in his attempt to make them quote-unquote sane. Sanity being at least partially defined by fully conforming to the accepted gender norms of society. You see, psychiatry as a discipline to treat the mentally disturbed can be dated to first becoming a thing around the late 18th and early 19th centuries. With such a new discipline, then, diagnoses of mental illnesses were quite vague. For example, the catch-all term when dealing with patients who refused to fit into society's accepted roles was a diagnosis of, quote, moral insanity, which was described by Englishman James Cowles Pritchard, the man who first coined the term in 1813, as a, quote, perversion of the natural feelings, affections, inclinations, temper, or habits. Meanwhile, along with his advent of early psychiatry also came the idea of treating those deemed insane in an institutional setting. As a result, the superintendents tasked with overseeing these facilities then became more than just doctors. They were what author Kate Moore adroitly calls, quote, society's paternal police, as one of their main roles as the heads of these institutions was to ensure that individuals who dared to reject the quote-unquote norms of society, norms that were more or less established by white Protestant middle-class men, were either forced to conform or locked away. Immigrant men, for example, tended to be deemed intemperate either because of the way they presented themselves differently from the so-called true Americans, or because of their consumption of alcohol based upon the traditions of the countries they hailed from. As a result, they would be locked away. This was also true of any man who displayed what was considered feminine behavior, while women were most often locked away for the crime of being assertive or ambitious, which were supposedly masculine traits, and thus unnatural for women to exhibit. So, men who showed their feelings or women who got angry were both likely to be deemed insane. McFarland then was without a doubt one of these agents of conformity. As a result, he, as you likely may have suspected, was not the ally that Elizabeth thought he was. Dr. McFarland was not listening to and encouraging her to talk because he was so much more enlightened than her husband, or because he had any belief concerning women's rights. Instead, he was simply trying to find the source of Elizabeth's madness. Madness that he was fully convinced was there, largely because her husband had said she was insane. Now, to be fair to Elizabeth, McFarland was on some level seemingly impressed by her, as in one letter to her husband, he would reference her, quote, fine mind and brilliant imagination. Yet, what Elizabeth never imagined was that this seeming respect was tinged by his belief that, quote, all these mental endowments were deep dyed with the color of radical disease. He encouraged her to speak then because he hoped she would reveal something that would clue him into her madness. McFarland, though, was unable to really zero in on anything until she gave him the first document geared toward defending her sanity. As he saw that document new evidence when Elizabeth for the first time let vent some of her true feelings concerning her husband. You see, up until that point, she had not really shared any of the rage she felt for him as a result of the way he had treated her and for putting her in this asylum, not to mention the way he had slighted her reputation by calling her insane, much less how he had effectively stolen her children away from her. In this letter, though, Elizabeth let loose a little, as she called Theophilus a, quote, perverted and unnatural man, as men were supposed to be protectors of women, and he had proven himself to be anything but. Now, presumably for you and me, Elizabeth was fully justified in feeling this way. However, for Dr. McFarland, these feelings towards her husband were proof at last of her madness, as no true sane woman could ever despise her husband. Such feelings then were the surest signs of madness. That being said, the thing that actually seemed to push McFarland over the edge, according to Elizabeth's account, was the brief passage in her letter that touched upon the time he had kissed her upon her forehead, a moment that Elizabeth said had been witnessed by someone else. This passage seemed to set McFarland off in some way. Now, in what way, Elizabeth did not share, but it was enough for her to make note of. McFarland, though, did not make his move immediately, but he would punish her for this offense. 5 days after she delivered the second missive consisting of a warning of her intentions to expose him if he did not repent and show some action toward improving the conditions in the asylum, Dr. McFarland would unexpectedly seize Elizabeth by the arm as she was returning to the 7th Ward after attending services in the chapel. He then silently but forcefully led Elizabeth through the halls of his asylum, leading her not to the 7th Ward, but to another where she had never been before, declaring as he thrust her into these new confines that, quote, you may occupy this ward, Mrs. Packard. The place where Elizabeth Packard had been led by an apparently vengeful Dr. McFarland was the 8th Ward, a place known to some in the asylum as the, quote, maniac's ward, as it was the home of the, quote, filthy, the suicidal, the raving, and the furious, where the 7th Ward was the home of patients like Elizabeth, middle-class women, oftentimes wives and mothers, who were deemed to be the most sane in the institution, likely because more than a few of them, like Elizabeth, were actually completely sane or at the most suffering from depression. The women populating the 8th were entirely different. These women were visibly disturbed. Elizabeth, in fact, would describe some as being, quote, mild and peaceful, others furious and raving, others deeply sad and silent melancholies, while a few never spoke at all. Additionally, many of the patients here were filthy, with their skin blackened by dirt and all manner of filth. That being said, the stench was the thing that stood out most to Elizabeth when she was brought to the ward. Indeed, the smell that had first assaulted Elizabeth's senses upon her initial arrival in the asylum was nothing compared to what she was confronted with here. There was just filth everywhere, including numerous puddles of water found by who knows what. There was also no furniture to be seen. While the amenities in the 7th ward had been considerably cheaper than those that had decorated the asylum's entrance hall, there were none to be seen in the 8th, likely having been broken already or were never present out of fear of their being used as weapons. Also of note, where Elizabeth had been given her own private room in the 7th ward, she was now placed in a dormitory with 5 other women. Women who Elizabeth would be locked up with on a nightly basis immediately following their evening meal, rather than at the 9:30 curfew that generally ruled over the asylum. On this night, which Elizabeth would describe as the, quote, blackest night of my existence, when she was plunged into darkness, the air was filled with screams, the sounds of some patients weeping loudly, as well as, quote, swearing, cursing, and still worse sounds from the vicious. Plus, even the beds here, much like the ward itself, reeked of filth, as the straw mattresses appeared to have not been replaced in who knows how long. This move then seems to have been meant as a clear punishment for Elizabeth for that second letter she had written. Dr. McFarlane clearly seemed to be looking to break her. For her part, though, Elizabeth did as she was told, as she had yet to purposely break any of the asylum's rules without permission. Indeed, as depressed as she had felt that first night, by the next morning, that depression had already passed, as Elizabeth dedicated herself even more fully to improving the conditions in the asylum for all her fellow patients. Now the task of keeping the ward clean and caring for the patients therein was supposed to be done by the tenants in charge of the ward, tenants who had clearly not been doing their job well before Elizabeth got there. That being said, she found the ward's attendants, 22 and 19-year-old sisters Minnie and Emily Tenney, to be at their core good, kind women who had simply been overwhelmed by their job, something she had first begun to recognize in the attendants in the 7th ward who she had started befriending as a part of her campaign to try and convince them to treat the patients better and with more compassion. Attendants who typically came to think of Elizabeth as a friend and more often than not became convinced that she was actually completely sane. Now, the thing was, the attendants' life was not easy. To start with, they were criminally underpaid, as they made less than shoemakers and woodworkers, all the while being extremely overworked, as they served 10-hour shifts, during which time they would be responsible for some 15 patients. Due to the hard, thankless nature of the work and the poor pay, the hospital's attendants tended to be young, poor, and not infrequently immigrants. They also tended to have a short shelf life on the job, resulting in constant turnover, with most on average lasting just 8.5 months. Some then became tyrants even if they set out to be anything but, while others became tyrants because they were simply the type who liked to exercise any measure of power over anyone they could, regardless of the harm they caused, or maybe even getting some enjoyment out of said harm. Others, meanwhile, were like the Tenney sisters, in that they were burned out and no longer cared, which explains the terrible state of things in the 8th ward upon Elizabeth's arrival, as the sisters had by this point more or less given up on even attempting to keep the ward and its patients clean, since a number of those placed under their care were those characterized as the, quote, filthy insane. These were patients who were known to smear the floors, the walls, their beds, and even themselves with their own filth. Elizabeth then took it upon herself to improve the conditions in the 8th ward, starting first by making sure the patients themselves were clean. Cautiously then, and with much care, she began approaching the other patients, who she gently and with much personal patience, one by one convinced them to trust her and allow her to bathe and clean them. To be clear, this was not easy, as oftentimes these women were truly disturbed, and would react by screaming and struggling. Yet, one by one, Elizabeth persevered, as she focused on washing their faces, necks, and hands first. Some even allowed her to clean their hair. Now, in the larger picture of things, this was simple work, but it exerted quite a dramatic change in the appearance among the other members of the ward, the sight of which, according to Elizabeth, quite took Dr. McFarlane by surprise when his rounds took him to the 8th ward, at which point, despite this decided change in circumstances, he still gave his typical greeting of, quote, "Good morning, Mrs. Packard." a greeting that now felt extremely fake. Following this initial, albeit successful campaign, Elizabeth then set about giving the patients a more complete cleansing as she looked to bathe them. To accomplish this, she set about establishing a system that would ensure that each member of the ward was cleaned, since to her surprise no such system existed. So she set about bathing her fellow members of the ward, always making sure to treat them with patience and empathy while doing so, regardless of how they responded to her ministrations. For Elizabeth's stance was, quote, "I do not regard an insane person as an object of reproach or contempt by any means. They are objects of pity and compassion, for I regard insanity as the greatest misfortune which can befall a human being in this life." For Elizabeth, the people she had suddenly been thrust among as a kind of punishment were simply human beings who deserved care and respect. As such, she was determined to give it to them, even if no one else was willing to. Now, this work was exhausting and time-consuming, but soon she wasn't alone as the Tenney sisters, inspired by her actions, joined Elizabeth in her work. Elizabeth and the Tenneys then set about cleaning not only the patients but the entire ward, as they scrubbed the walls and floors and replaced the filthy, soiled, and rotting straw mattresses with new ones. In all, it took them 3 weeks to thoroughly clean all the patients and rooms of the ward, by which point they then had to start over from the beginning, now having to go back and clean the patients and rooms that they had first started with. It was a never-ending cycle, but it vastly improved the conditions of the ward. Having worked side by side with Elizabeth and getting to know her in the process, it quickly became impossible for the Tenney sisters to see or treat her like the others. Indeed, many would reportedly tell Elizabeth, quote, "I shall not treat you as I do the other patients, notwithstanding the doctor has ordered me to. I shall use my own judgment and treat you as I think you deserve to be treated." As such, they allowed Elizabeth to retrieve some of the clothes from her trunk, a trunk that Dr. McFarland had seized and placed in storage after he had searched it for copies of her second letter that had threatened to expose his wrongdoings and which, most importantly, contained testimonials from his own employees. Thanks to this work and the kindness of the Tenney sisters who Elizabeth had befriended, it seemed like her time in the 8th Ward might not actually be as bad as she had initially feared. Then came an encounter with one 18-year-old Jenny Hazlitt, who regularly could be heard at night crying for a boy named Willie. It happened one afternoon as Elizabeth was sitting in her chair reading her Bible or one of the books on science that she liked to consume. It was during this quiet moment that Jenny happened to come into the room. The young woman then quietly sat on the floor curling up at the older woman's feet. She even started playing with the hem of Elizabeth's dress. Elizabeth then, likely being reminded of her own children, reached out absent-mindedly and gently stroked the young woman's hair, before leaning over to kiss her forehead in a motherly fashion. Jenny, though, was not expecting this and reacted violently. She swung out, her fist crashing into Elizabeth's temple, a brutal blow that briefly knocked the older woman unconscious. Indeed, it was such a terrible blow that for a time it was feared that Elizabeth might lose her eye. Dr. McFarland, though, did not seem to care or worry about her safety. In fact, if anything, he seemed to approve of Elizabeth being put into such dangerous circumstances, as he now insisted that Elizabeth eat her meal sitting beside one Sarah Triplett, a woman who was considered to be the most dangerous female patient in the entire asylum. Even the staff were reportedly frightened of her, as Triplett came from the asylum's 5th ward, which was primarily populated by women who had been sent there by the courts due to dangerous criminal behavior. It wasn't just the constant threat of the woman sitting right next to her that made mealtime a miserable experience for Elizabeth, as it seemed that the dining hall devolved into violence on an almost daily basis. Typically, things would start small, with an issue between one pair of patients or another. Their issue, though, whatever it might be, would quickly spin out of control, until the entire dining hall was filled with flying food, plates, and broken glass. Whenever this happened, Elizabeth would try to quietly sneak out of the hall, leaving her meal half-eaten. She, however, was not always able to make good on this escape. Oftentimes, in fact, she would be snatched by the hair and dragged around the hall by one of the other patients. Between this and the habit of some of the other women she was forced to sleep with spending their nights throwing around their chamber pots, Elizabeth actually begged Dr. McFarland to at the very least allow her to have her own room in the 8th ward. Yet, like he so often did with her friends in the 7th when they had raised concerns about their treatment, the doctor simply turned and, even as Elizabeth was still speaking, walked away without another word. She got much the same response when she asked to be allowed to work in the asylum's laundry or ironing rooms, as since being placed in the 8th ward, Elizabeth had not been allowed out for any reason other than to go to the dining hall, which was tough for Elizabeth, as she had always been a very active woman. So now being confined to the ward was not easy for her, all of which made this an incredibly rough time for Elizabeth. Things actually got bad enough that she had suicidal thoughts as she started to believe that death might be her only way out of the asylum. Yet thoughts of her children always kept her from going any further down that path. Eventually, though, Elizabeth, like she seemed to do everywhere she went, was able to make friends among some of her fellow patients, like, for example, Betsy Clark, a 56-year-old housekeeper who, like Elizabeth, originally hailed from Massachusetts. Then there was Emily Goldsby, who was only in the asylum due to her epilepsy, and Emmeline Bridgman, who had been placed there simply because she suffered from depression. Which may sound surprising to you, but depression was apparently the reason why a good 2/3 of the patients in the asylum were there. Elizabeth became especially good friends with Emmeline as Elizabeth recognized that, quote, instead of treating her as a criminal, she needs unusual forbearance and kindness to inspire her with self-confidence. Elizabeth then, thanks to the strength she drew from these human connections, resumed her campaign to help her fellow patients as she looked to shield them from the abusive hospital staff. Upon first arriving during her stay in the 7th Ward, Elizabeth had not seen the true nature of the asylum, although there were a few hints here and there which led her to begin having doubts about the facility and the man who ran it. Since arriving in the 8th Ward, however, Elizabeth had come face to face with some of the true dark nature of the asylum on nearly a daily basis. According to Elizabeth herself, quote, abuse patients was the rule at the hospital, while those justly and kindly treated was the exception. Among the cruel treatments that she witnessed were the small, uncomfortable rooms that had iron screens stretched across the windows that women were thrown into as a form of solitary confinement, something which it should be noted that according to experts like psychiatrist Dr. Stuart Gracian can have devastating consequences on mental health, stating that it can exacerbate pre-existing mental health issues or cause the onset of acute mental illness, which, doesn't sound like a good thing to be doing to anyone, much less patients in a mental hospital. This, however, was employed as a frequent punishment for even minor offenses like speaking during mealtime. Women were also regularly trussed up in straitjackets. This, notably, however, wasn't for their safety or for the safety of others like you might expect. Indeed, the most dangerous patients in the asylum tended to be allowed to roam about freely unrestrained. Instead, straitjackets were used as a form of punishment and as a treatment, as Dr. McFarlane considered restraint to be, quote, absolute essential in any form of associated treatment. As she began to witness this and so much more after being relegated to the 8th Ward, Elizabeth came to a series of revelations. The first concerned herself, as she realized that, quote, I always stand up for the oppressed. She could not just sit there and do nothing, even though she herself was not often the target of such abuses. Meanwhile, her second revelation concerned the hospital and the horrors it contained. You see, Elizabeth realized that the outside world had no real clue about what was really going on inside those walls, lest they would be just as horrified as she was. Which brought Elizabeth to her third revelation. Someone needed to expose the asylum and Dr. McFarlane for what they truly were, and that person, she realized, might as well be herself. The best course of action to accomplish this, she decided, was to start keeping a daily journal, in which she would take notes on the actual goings-on in the asylum and the various abuses that she beheld. The problem was, ever since sharing with the doctor her second letter in which she had threatened to expose him, she had been denied any access to pen and paper. Elizabeth, though, was nothing if not resourceful, so she began hunting and scrounging for what she needed. Old pens carelessly discarded or left behind by inattentive doctors, all but used up nubs of pencils, the edge of a newspaper belonging to one of the other patients that she discreetly tore away, all became prizes that Elizabeth seized and hid away for her work. With such meager supplies, Elizabeth quickly became a master of writing as small as possible and filling up every bit of space on a scrap of paper by writing in whatever direction necessary, a habit she actually had before to some extent and now took full advantage of. In this quest, Elizabeth was also aided by the slight loosening of the reins when she was finally allowed to leave the 8th Ward to go and work in the asylum's sewing room once again. She would make at least a vest and a pair of pants daily while working there, all the while regularly scouring the space for whatever scraps of paper or writing instruments that she could find. All of which Priscilla Hosmer, the employee charged with overseeing the sewing room, could not help but witness. Yet she chose to ignore it due to the friendship that had formed between her and Elizabeth, and because Priscilla had grown increasingly disillusioned with the asylum and its director, Dr. McFarland, who she considered to be a, quote, man who has no higher aim than his own selfish ambition. Priscilla, you see, had also borne witness to numerous horrors within those walls, horrors that Elizabeth asked her to tell her more about so that she might document them. Now, keep in mind, this kind of activity was exactly the reason why Elizabeth had been sent to the 8th Ward and forbidden access to any and all writing supplies. So, to keep her journal of abuses secret, Elizabeth started hiding her scraps of paper inside the crown of her traveling bonnet. Month after month then passed like this until she had been in the asylum for a full year, and still there was no hope on the horizon of getting out. Eventually, though, McFarland, perhaps trying a different tact in his attempts to manipulate and control Elizabeth in the name of curing her madness, began loosening the restrictions he had placed upon her when she was initially transferred to the 8th Ward. This was when she started being allowed to leave the ward to work in the sewing room again, and she was also allowed to visit the chapel and even walk in the gardens outside. The thing was, by this point, Elizabeth had decided that she would not play along with such games. The beautiful exterior of the hospital, she now realized, was nothing more than a pretty little lie that only served to hide the true darkness within the asylum. Additionally, Elizabeth was determined to not be complicit in her own imprisonment by choosing to walk back inside after going out for a walk. As such, she made the decision that if she was ever going to walk outside the walls of the asylum, it was going to be because she was never going back inside. After over a year in the asylum in Jacksonville, Elizabeth would in 1861 actually be visited by her husband Theophilus, a visit which Dr. McFarland apparently found quite enlightening, as it provided further proof of her mad, irrational hatred for her husband. Elizabeth, like all wives, had no real reason to hate her husband. After all, he only had her locked away in an asylum for speaking her own mind, locked away from her beloved children for daring to have thoughts and beliefs that differed from her husband's. A husband who had also recently sent her a letter in which he suggested breaking up the family, as he asked her opinion on who he should hand her children off to raise them in her stead. A letter that Elizabeth rightly suspected was nothing more than a toothless threat aimed at breaking her so that she would agree to become the proper wife that she used to be. The letter, though, had let slip one revealing piece of information, that her saintly husband had foisted all the duties of cooking and maintaining the household on his 11-year-old daughter, something that Elizabeth really seemed to irrationally despise him for, as she would write, quote, "How can a father put upon this child of 11 years the care of a woman, the care of a babe, in addition to the care of a family while she needs to attend school?" Indeed, Elizabeth was so irrational in her response to this situation that she completely refused to speak to Theophilus throughout the entire 3 days of his visit. For Dr. McFarland, this was uncommonly callous behavior, as it was extremely unnatural for a, quote, "true woman to meet with one who had been a lover and a husband after 1 year's separation, even if he had abused her without one gush of affection." Yep, he just said that every sane woman should be happy to see their husband after a year's separation, even if he had abused her. Indeed, he would write that Elizabeth's, quote, "hatred of her husband had something diabolical about it. Every instinct of love was banished from her." Dr. McFarland then was more convinced than ever that there was something wrong with Elizabeth Packard. There was simply no other explanation for her hatred of her husband other than madness. Meanwhile, he was also worried by the fact that patients who had been in the asylum as long as Elizabeth had typically showed some signs of breaking. They were typically just worn down by everything by this point. But Elizabeth, if anything, seemed to be more defiant and more determined than ever. Indeed, she had resumed her activities flaunting his control, as she actively assisted patients in writing letters to their families requesting their release. She'd also started working to have her own letters smuggled out of the asylum to bypass his strict control of the mail. He'd even had her belongings searched and caught her in possession of a number of writing implements that he had expressly forbidden her access to. This search and the resulting discoveries were alarming for Elizabeth, but it had not broken her by any means. Indeed, if anything, it just further emboldened the woman, as McFarland's search of her belongings had drawn the protests of members of his own staff, who felt his treatment of her to be too heavy-handed. Among those who were siding with Elizabeth against McFarland was the asylum's new cook Celia Coe, who, when she was an attendant, had been the person who taught Elizabeth how to dance. Celia, in her new position, now made sure to give Elizabeth fruits, as the normal fare provided by the hospital, which consisted largely of bread and potatoes, did not agree with the other woman. Elizabeth, meanwhile, despite the search and seizure of some of her writing implements, just kept on discreetly writing away. As you may have noted, McFarland had not found and seized any of her actual writing, so she continued writing and hiding the product of her work in places like the false lining in her luggage, or beneath a false bottom in her satchel, or pinned discreetly inside various pieces of her wardrobe. Time then continued to pass in this manner, and still Elizabeth seemed no closer to getting out. Come April 1862, after a full year and 10 months in the asylum, Elizabeth remained as defiant as ever. The Eighth Ward, meanwhile, had changed, although not through any direct result of Elizabeth. Instead, the change was brought about by the asylum now having a new wing for female patients. This had led to a slight reshuffling of which patients were kept where, which resulted in the most dangerous patients from the Eighth Ward being removed, thereby leaving Elizabeth with the so-called quiet maniacs. This also led to Elizabeth having her own room again, in which she had a chair of her own complete with a footstool where she could sit and read her Bible and oftentimes a book on science. She also had her trunk of clothes that had been confiscated when she had been sent to the Eighth but had since been returned to her. Elizabeth, however, was not fooled by these comforts. She was still very much imprisoned against her will and was still surrounded by cruelty and abuse. Indeed, the situation in the Eighth Ward now was actually worse than it had ever been. While the most dangerous patients had been removed, the asylum's attendants overseeing the ward had gotten significantly worse. You see, the Tenney sisters, who had been moved to follow Elizabeth's example of caring for their troubled patients, were now gone. In their place now stood women who seemed to have far less compassion and empathy. Punishments in the Eighth Ward under these new women were now more common and more brutal than before. Indeed, Elizabeth now bore witness to her fellow patients being beaten and choked on a nearly daily basis, all of which seemed especially egregious considering they were no longer dealing with the violent patients who used to populate the ward. Sure, Elizabeth would admit her fellow patients could be difficult sometimes, but there was no reason to punish them in such ways. This new regime was so brutal, in fact, that on one occasion one of the attendants choked a 20-year-old patient with such force that she gouged a hole in the woman's neck with her fingernail, necessitating Elizabeth to bind the wound. Yet, while this event was particularly notable because of the wound it resulted in, it was far from unique, as Elizabeth regularly witnessed other patients being choked until their faces turned black and their tongues started to swell and stick out of their mouths. Now, there was one change to the ward that may have actually been a result of Elizabeth's tireless activities, and that was that the Eighth and all the other wards in the hospital now had their own washtub. Yet, unlike Elizabeth, who had been gentle and caring when attempting to bathe the other patients, the new attendants seemingly primarily used the bath as a form of punishment, a device for torturing any who had crossed them. For example, Elizabeth could clearly recall one night as she was locked in her own room being able to hear the sounds of the attendants dragging a patient to the room with the tub. This patient was new to the asylum and had been constantly screaming for much of the day, likely in no small part due to the terror of being placed in the asylum. Yet instead of trying to comfort this woman or simply allowing her to calm down on her own, the attendants were dragging her to the bathroom to teach her a lesson. Elizabeth then could hear the sounds of this new woman being physically inserted into the tub that was filled with cold water, a shock that only led the woman to scream even louder, a sound that was abruptly cut off and replaced by something akin to gargling noises as the woman's head was thrust under the water. The ward then grew terrifyingly silent for a worrying amount of time, until finally the water sloshed and the new woman could be heard weakly crying for help. Her voice now raspy, the new patient then could be heard promising not to scream anymore, but even this sound was soon cut off, as she was obviously thrust under the water again by attendants determined to show her who was in charge. Over and over again that night, Elizabeth recalled how moments of the woman desperately begging for help or forgiveness or whatever were interrupted by long, worrying stretches of silence. Now, to be clear, this was not unique, and nor did the attendants always use cold water in this punishment, as sometimes they used scalding hot water. It also has to be said that this punishment was used for all manner of quote-unquote offenses, like, for example, patients who wouldn't stop talking, or laughing, or just taking part in general silly behavior. They even used this punishment on patients who tried to insist on bathing alone, as they sought some level of modesty. Now, to be fair, as bad as things were in the Jacksonville Asylum under Dr. McFarland, and don't get me wrong, they were terrible, the frightening thing is they actually could have been even worse. You see, other psychiatrists, especially those in Europe, were effectively experimenting on their patients as they attempted to find a new treatment for their so-called madness, and one of the favorite targets for these new so-called treatments were a woman's sexual organs, which they believed were oftentimes the root of their insanity. Women during this time in other asylums then were having leeches or caustic chemical substances placed upon their genitals in the name of curing their madness. Ovaries were also removed in some cases, while in others the electrical current was applied to the uterus as a treatment. Then there was Dr. Isaac Baker Brown, the senior surgeon at the London Surgical Home, who was a leading proponent of surgically removing a woman's clitoris as a cure for insanity. Now, luckily, it seems that neither Elizabeth nor any of the other patients in Jacksonville had to worry about such treatments, but still, as I've already illuminated, things were far from good. As such, Elizabeth was constantly trying to intervene and put a stop to these abuses as she tried to protect her fellow patients, behavior which only earned her threats for attempting to intervene and on occasion punishments of her own, which included a pair of trips to the so-called screen room for solitary confinement. Elizabeth would even try appealing to Dr. McFarland to stop this behavior by his attendants, holding on to the hope that maybe he just didn't know about their cruelty and upon being informed would put a stop to it. McFarland, however, would claim that there was simply no way to stop such abuses, as he could not be everywhere at all times, and unless he actually bore witness to the abuses, he insisted there was nothing he could do about it, as certainly he could not listen to anything his patients had to say about the abuses they were suffering. After all, each and every one of them was insane, and thus completely untrustworthy. Indeed, complaining about being mistreated was, if anything in his eyes, just another sign of their illness. Elizabeth, however, was far from alone in being alarmed by the abuses being committed against the patients in the asylum. For example, her friend Celia Coe, the asylum's cook, was also deeply disturbed by much of what she had seen. Indeed, she had witnessed horrors that Elizabeth had not, as she, unlike Elizabeth, had much more freedom to move about the asylum. Possibly the thing that concerned Celia the most was an attendant who worked in the 5th ward named Lizzie Bonner. Lizzie was described as a, quote, large, coarse, stout Irish woman stronger than most men. She also was reported to have a terrible temper, and was known to carry a bunch of heavy keys at her waist that she liked to use as a weapon. This wasn't just based upon her reputation either, as Celia had personally witnessed the violence this woman was capable of, with one time in particular standing out. Celia, you see, had one day come upon Lizzie mounted atop one of the patients as she held onto a handful of their hair, which the attendant was using to slam the poor woman's head into the ground as if it was a hammer. Lizzie, though, would justify her actions by declaring that the poor patient had the, quote, devil in her and I mean to beat it out of her. Indeed, even though Lizzie soon had the woman in a straitjacket, she did not stop her assault. Instead, she tied the now helpless woman to some nearby bars, at which point she once again seized a woman's head and began slamming it over and over again against the sharp corners of said bars. Soon a deep gash appeared in the back of the woman's scalp due to this assault, but still Lizzie kept going, so that each blow now resulted in a spray of crimson blood. Then there was the account of Sophie Olson, who, like Elizabeth, had been placed in the asylum under the care of Dr. McFarland by her own husband. Sophie's brothers, though, had apparently trusted neither man, and would eventually get Sophie released into their care, especially since her health seemed to be failing due to the condition she found herself in while under McFarland's supervision. Sophie, too, would have tales to tell of Miss Lizzie Bonner. Sophie, you see, upon arrival, actually offered to help the attendant, likely recognizing how hard her job must be. However, she got nothing but hostility in return, and given time, Sophie came to see that, quote, Lizzie Bonner was more insane than anyone in her care. I did not fear them with all their fury, but I confess I did fear her with her much wilder fury. I had always some expedient by which I could easily disarm the very wildest maniacs, but I never could disarm or tame their far more ferocious keeper. Sophie indeed seemed to have good reason to fear Lizzie, as evidence of her brutality was all around her. According to Sophie, the violence committed by Lizzie and the other attendants was painted all over the faces of her fellow patients that were, quote, frightfully blackened by blows partially received from each other in their internecine conflicts, but mostly, I subsequently discovered, by their attendants. Violence, it seemed, was doled out freely and with little cause, as again, according to Sophie, quote, I have many times seen even tardy or reluctant obedience punished with fearful severity. I have seen the attendant strike and unmercifully beat on the head her patients with a bunch of heavy keys, which she carried fastened by a cord around her waist, leaving their faces blackened and scarred for weeks. I have seen her twist their arms and cross them behind the back, tie them in that position, and beat the victim till the other patients would cry out begging her to desist. All of which he had personally witnessed happening for minor offenses, or even offenses that Sophie was sure that the patients hadn't even committed. Tired of personally beholding such violence or hearing of it secondhand, all the while being ignored by the one man with the power to stop it, Elizabeth in June 1862, 2 years since she had first been placed in Jacksonville, would attempt to bring attention to these abuses by penning a letter to the editors of the New York Independent and a number of Chicago papers, in the hopes that the power of the press and the resulting public outrage would lead to changes. In this, quote, appeal on behalf of the insane, Elizabeth would lay out some of the abuses that she was aware of, noting as she did that, quote, it is the artful doctor's policy to pronounce all witnesses to these scenes of cruelty as insane persons, hoping that this his lying testimony in many cases may outlaw them as witnesses against him and his doings through his own attendants. To that point, Elizabeth would notably not write her own name at the end of the letter, but instead she would pretend to be her friends Celia and James Coe, the asylum's cooks, who were now willing to openly assist Elizabeth in this campaign by allowing her to write this letter on their behalf, while also agreeing to be interviewed by the papers about any questions they might have, because they were now no longer employed at the asylum. Unfortunately, though, no public outcry would be raised about the goings-on in the Jacksonville Asylum. In fact, it does not seem like Elizabeth's letter was ever published, which was likely because it was 1862 and a little something called the American Civil War was raging at this point in time. Meanwhile, well away from the front lines, life in the asylum continued to be a waking nightmare, as the 8th Ward got new attendants. One, Mary Bailey, who consistently used, quote, insulting and abusive language when dealing with the patients, while her partner, Miss Smith, was seemingly the worst yet, as she was quick-tempered and cruel. So, with no help apparently coming from outside the asylum's walls, Elizabeth once again looked within for a savior, at which point Elizabeth, with her inherent belief in the good in all people and a firm believer in the power of redemption, once again turned her hopes to Dr. McFarland. Sure, he had shown himself to be false, cruel, and uncaring, but perhaps she could reform him. Maybe he could still become the man she had initially hoped him to be. So, to try and nurture his supposed better nature, Elizabeth took a kinder approach to the doctor, as rather than being upset about the abuses, she instead tried to encourage him to be kinder and more sympathetic in his approach, a tack that actually seemed to be working when Miss Smith was transferred to the ironing room and replaced in the 8th Ward by a much kinder and more reasonable 18-year-old named Adelaide Tryon. Indeed, Elizabeth would be so encouraged by what she perceived to be a change in the asylum director that in September 1862, after 2 years and 3 months in the asylum, she actually approached him and asked for the opportunity to speak with the hospital trustees during their quarterly visit. To her surprise, then, not only did McFarland agree to her request, but he even allowed her access to paper and writing implements with which she could use to prepare a statement for the trustees. This was huge for Elizabeth, as it meant having access to someone other than her husband or Dr. McFarland who had control over her fate. As you see, the trustees were the ones who ultimately decided whether patients would be released. The trustees were the only people that held more power within the asylum than Dr. McFarland. They oversaw his work, and indeed their quarterly meetings always involved an inspection of the asylum, during which time they toured the facilities, or to be more precise, they toured the parts of the asylum that McFarland had prepared for their visit, meaning they saw nothing he did not want them to see. Then, following this inspection, the trustees would join the doctor for a sumptuous meal in his quarters, which is all to say they were more than inclined to trust the doctor on whatever it was he had to say on any matters concerning the asylum and its patients. Indeed, they had been well prepared by the doctor to not trust any complaints coming from the patients, as they were all by definition insane and, quote, liars by nature. Which is all to say that while the trustees had the final say in whether patients were released or not, these decisions ultimately heavily relied upon McFarland's recommendations. The next trustee meeting was scheduled to take place on the 4th of September, on which day, in preparation for her interview, Elizabeth made sure to pick out one of her nicer outfits, which was nowhere near as nice as she would have liked, seeing as how her best clothes were still being denied to her by Theophilus. Speaking of her so-called husband, Elizabeth was surprised when she was escorted in to meet with the trustees to find him in there with them. Apparently, he had just given them his own presentation concerning her, and now that he was done, it was Elizabeth's turn. Upon being given 10 minutes to present her case, Elizabeth began calmly reading from the statement she had prepared and given to McFarland the previous day for his approval. in which she explained why she had disagreed with her husband's interpretation of Christianity and why she could not in good conscience teach her children his beliefs. Elizabeth, though, fairly quickly diverted from the statement that McFarland had approved of the day before, as she instead began reading from papers that she had discreetly prepared for this occasion. As she switched from her approved statement, Elizabeth actually addressed Dr. McFarland directly, asking him if her husband had the, quote, right to assume that my teachings are ruinous in their tendency. Have I not a right to teach them what I think is God's revealed will, or must I yield my own convictions of truth and duty to his dictation? Would he be willing that I should assume this authority over him? Or in other words, is he doing by me as he would wish to be done by? How would you, Dr. McFarland, receive such a demand from me as you seem bound to respect from him? Suppose I should say to you, Dr. McFarland, I conscientiously believe that the legitimate tendency of Mr. Packard's creed is to make hard, unfeeling, bigoted, cruel, tyrannical characters like himself, and now, out of regard to these helpless children's interests, I demand that you take Mr. Packard from his position in society and his family, and from all his constitutional rights as an American citizen, and imprison him in this insane asylum for life, or until I can remove his children out of the reach of his influence. How would you receive such a demand from me, the mother of the children, whose interest in their welfare is as deep at least as their father's? Would you not regard it as an insane request, and would you not employ it as proof that I was a fit subject for the insane asylum? Basically saying that if she had demanded her husband be treated like she was for these same reasons, she would have not only been ignored but locked away. Yet, despite deviating from her approved script, McFarland made no move to stop Elizabeth, and nor did the trustees, even after the 10 minutes she had been allotted had come and gone. Indeed, she would speak for 50 minutes, at which point they asked her to continue. Elizabeth then explained to the trustees that yes, she had changed since first marrying Theophilus, but that was not a sign of madness. Instead, it was simply the result of normal personal growth. Indeed, she compared her husband placing her in the insane asylum as a result of this personal growth as being akin to having her breasts removed because she had not had them when she was a child, a statement which seemed to amuse the trustees and further gained their approval. However, after she was finished speaking, Elizabeth was asked to wait outside while the trustees considered her case. After some 10 minutes of deliberation, Elizabeth would be informed that the trustees had not actually reached a decision. Instead, they opted to postpone their ruling until their next meeting, which would be taking place in December, 90 days hence. Elizabeth chose to interpret this turn of events as good news. They had not rejected her request for release, and Dr. McFarland had apparently even personally recommended such a course of action. Indeed, when they spoke in his office the next day, he actually requested a copy of the document that she had presented to the trustees. For her part, Elizabeth was more than happy to create some extra copies of her writing. She was quite proud of her work, and had found the process of organizing her ideas and putting her thoughts on paper invigorating ever since she had first done so in preparation for addressing her husband's Bible classes. In fact, this request gave Elizabeth an idea. If her presentation had been as persuasive as Dr. McFarland suggested it was, then it would likely help her cause if she were able to have it printed so that others outside the asylum could read it, with the idea being that it would help to generate public pressure to convince the trustees to release her. When Elizabeth brought up this idea, McFarland was surprisingly supportive, as he supplied her with paper and the promise to see her work published. As she got to writing, Elizabeth's initial plan was to publish a pamphlet that outlined her own personal case. She quickly abandoned that idea, however, as she realized that the problem she faced was bigger than just herself as an individual. Elizabeth recognized that if the law had allowed this to happen to her, then it could happen to anyone. Indeed, she had met more than a few women in the asylum who had suffered a similar fate as she had. She knew then that there were likely many women locked up across the country who were just as sane as she was. Elizabeth then didn't need just to argue her own case, but the case that all women should be free to think their own thoughts and speak their own minds without fear that some oppressive man in their life may have them locked up and labeled insane. A pamphlet, then, she decided would never suffice in making such a case. She needed to write a whole book. When informed of this new idea, McFarland was again strangely supportive and encouraging. He even went so far as to instruct the asylum's attendants to not disturb Elizabeth in her work. What Elizabeth produced in this time, author Kate Moore would describe as very stream of consciousness in style. It was as if all the thoughts and ideas that had been pent up for years suddenly came pouring out of her. She moved freely from topic to topic, as she wrote about religion, her children, politics, and what she had seen while in the asylum. One topic that she kept returning to, however, was that of women's rights, as she wrote things like, quote, "Does our government think that because it protects the inalienable rights of the men of America, it protects the rights of all? Are not women citizens? Are not their rights worth protecting?" She would also declare that women, quote, "don't want fragments of liberty anymore, nor fragments of men to disperse it neither." The woman who once looked for men to be the protectors of women that she believed them to be was clearly now disillusioned with that idea, as she would write that, quote, "Never let a man now say that a woman is a dependent being, for she is not. She has fought her own battle. She has gained her own victory. She has declared her own independence. She is free." The cause of women's rights was obviously close to Elizabeth's heart, in no small part due to the fact that she knew without a change in the laws, she would still have no protection from her husband, as even if she managed to get out of this asylum, he could just as easily turn around and place her in another one. To be clear though, Elizabeth wasn't just fighting for women like herself to get more rights, she was also fighting for the insane who she had been living with in the asylum, and for African Americans and Native Americans as well. Essentially, Elizabeth was standing up for and demanding rights and protections for all oppressed people. Meanwhile, Elizabeth suddenly had the freedom to write all of this because of Dr. McFarland. Not only did he authorize her ability to write this book, but he was even encouraging her to do so. More so, he was willing to listen to and speak with her at length in ways her husband never had. As a result, her opinion of him began to change, as she once again started to see him as the kind and intelligent man she had first believed him to be. Also brightening Elizabeth's mood during this period was a visit from her two eldest boys, Isaac and Theo. She had not seen nor heard from either boy for some time, and was relieved to see them both well, considering that there had been some talk of joining the Union Army. Their father, however, had forbidden such a course, so instead they had looked to aid the cause by working as merchants attached to a Nebraska regiment, selling the soldiers whatever goods they might need. For their part, they were delighted to see Elizabeth in such good spirits, and that she remained the mother they knew and loved, still relatively unchanged by the harsh turn her life had taken. Speaking of harsh turns, as it turns out, Theophilus had lost the minister job in Manteno. You know, the same job he had been so worried about losing due to Elizabeth's influence. Well, he had lost it anyway and was now living on charity. Meanwhile, sensing that her time in the asylum might finally be coming to an end, Elizabeth threw all of her energy into her book, believing that once she had it published, it would at the very least be tangible proof of her sanity, and thus would serve as a shield from her vengeful and oppressive husband. So, by the midpoint of October 1862, after 6 weeks of work, Elizabeth finished a book she had taken to calling The Great Drama, which consisted of some 2,500 handwritten pages. With this done, Elizabeth hoped to have the book published before the next meeting of the trustees in December, or to make things a bit more reasonable, she hoped to have the first section of her book published, something that McFarland agreed to finance. Yet, despite Elizabeth putting in the work to carefully copy out and prepare the first volume of her book for the printers, the doctor kept either dragging his feet or giving excuses as to why it hadn't been printed. This is because the unfortunate reality of the situation was Dr. McFarland hadn't actually changed. Instead, he had, much like Elizabeth, simply changed tactics. You see, when she had switched tactics to try to appeal to what she hoped to be his better nature, McFarland, potentially sensing that his harsh approach was not working, switched back to his original softer approach. Indeed, the whole reason why he started encouraging her to write was simply a new version of his original tactic of having long discussions with Elizabeth, during which he allowed her to speak at length as he looked for the root of her insanity. As such, the actual reason why he had recommended her release wasn't that he thought her cured or was finally convinced that she had never actually been insane. The cold reality was he recommended her release because he was just tired of all the trouble she had caused for him. Elizabeth was simply too much of a nuisance for the doctor to keep her in the asylum any longer. Indeed, it was McFarland's actual opinion that Elizabeth was insane and incurably so. As such, there was no point in keeping her in the asylum. He could not cure her, and she would simply make his life more difficult, so he wanted her gone. Indeed, the doctor would actually tell some of his colleagues that the only reason why he had recommended her release was because that was the, quote, only means of getting rid of an intolerable and unendurable source of annoyance. In fact, as it turns out, he was doing so at the first available opportunity, since the asylum's policy was to hold patients for 2 years to attempt to treat them. This then had been the first meeting following that initial 2-year period that McFarland actually had the opportunity to get rid of the most troublesome patient he ever had the misfortune to encounter. Yet despite this, come December, when the trustees met again, they announced that Elizabeth's release was, quote, indefinitely postponed. This was a decision that they apparently came to after speaking with her relatives, namely her husband. The trustees had then decided to halt proceedings out of fear that her release might be, quote, injurious to her family. Elizabeth's hopes then of getting out of the asylum and returning to her beloved children had once again been crushed. Elizabeth Packard, however, refused to be broken by this turn of events. Instead, as she would write, quote, woman is too volatile and spiritual a being to be kept down by mere brute force. You can cage a bird and thus keep her down on a level with her serpent mate, but just give her the use of her powers, its freedom, and she will rise. Indeed, Elizabeth Packard was far from defeated, yet the story of her eventual release from the asylum, her fight to prove her sanity, and her fight to keep other women from suffering the same fate and to put a stop to the kinds of abuses she had witnessed while in the asylum will have to, for now, remain a story for another time.
Thank you for listening to Distorted History. If you would like to help out, please rate and review the podcast and tell your friends if you think they'll be interested. If you're feeling especially generous and would like to help keep this podcast going, please consider visiting my Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/distortedhistory and donating a few bucks. Anything you can give is greatly appreciated. I will be posting updates on future episodes and sources there in addition to posting them on Twitter as I usually do. With all that being said, once again, thank you for listening, and until next time.